Hi everyone, welcome back to MATA35. Today we're going to, so in the last lecture we talked about linear regression and how we can apply Python as a data analysis pipeline to doing linear regression. Of course, we did a very simple linear regression. We just did a single variable linear regression for the most part. Or, I mean, that's all we did last time. So given samples of some dependent variable, y1 through yn. So these are the samples. So these are the measurements that you're taking at values of some independent variable, x1 through xn, well, we want to find a linear model. So f of x is equal to mx plus b, such that when you apply this f function to your independent variables xi, so these might be the time of day, these might be a location along an axis, well, such that you get approximately the dependent variables, the observations. So we fit a line to it, and this is one way of modeling data. This is one of the most straightforward ways of building up a model based on multiple data points. Now, this is, of course, oftentimes in real life and in biology, we have more than one variable, or more than just one independent and one dependent variable. So what do we do then? So, let's that go away. So what if we have two independent variables? And one dependent variable? Well, things get a little bit more complicated. So, for example, what if we want to measure the water temperature in Lake Ontario? And we want to know how the temperature varies as a function of location. So, obviously, we can't measure the water temperature in Lake Ontario everywhere, but maybe we take the water temperatures here near Toronto, and let's say it's 15 degrees Celsius. Maybe we take another point here, and that's like 14.5 degrees Celsius. Another point, and so we just take a bunch of samples, 14 degrees Celsius, and let's say up here it's 13 degrees Celsius, etc. So we can take a bunch of sample points and then ask ourselves, can we build a model so that we can interpolate between these and try to figure out what the temperature is elsewhere in the lake without actually having to measure it everywhere? And so the answer is, well, yes, unless, or we wouldn't be having this course. And one way to imagine it is when we have these data points with two independent variables and one dependent variable, it's sort of like a function from the plane to the z-axis. And so instead of having a surface going through the 3D space, instead you have a bunch of points scattered around in your 3D space. And so you have here, you can think of the x and y axis as the, so let's see, x and y axis down here, position in Lake Ontario. And the z-axis here is the temperature. And of course, once you have all these data points, you might ask, can I build a model? And there are many different kinds of models you can build, but in this course, we're going to be focusing mostly on the simplest possible models, which is we're going to try to find something that's linear. Now, what is a linear surface? Well, the answer to this, we talked about this a little bit when we were talking about tangent planes, but the answer is, when you're working in 3D, the best linear approximation to a surface is a plane. So something like this. Let me actually switch over into, where is it? Let me switch over so that I can actually show you guys what this looks like, and rotate it a little bit. So what we have is we have a bunch of data points in our space here. And you can see that what we're trying to do is we're trying to find a plane that best fits all these data points. So so obviously these data points don't actually lie on the plane, but the question is, how far away are these data points from the plane going down or going up? And this plane here actually happens to be the best fit plane. So this minimizes the squared errors, or the mean squared errors for each of these data points. So now you might be asking, how do I actually compute this? Well, the answer to this is, well, this is just a two-variable linear regression, or two independent variable linear regression. Let's go back to the PowerPoint. And the way it works is we have two independent variables. So we're going to call them x and y. So here, now y we're using as an independent variable instead of a dependent one. Obviously, you can use whatever variable names you want. So x and y are the independent variables, and now we're going to call z the dependent variable. And so we're going to have some number of samples, the z1 through zn, which are our temperatures at different points, at certain values of x1 coordinates. So these are coordinates in the 2D plane that is Lake Ontario. And then we want to build a linear model, which is f of xy is equal to m1x plus m2y plus b, where b is where m1, m2, and b are constants, such that we have the best fit plane. Okay, so any questions so far? It's basically just the straightforward generalization. Instead of having just one independent variable, now we have two independent variables, and we're building a model off of that. So this is the basic idea behind multilinear regression. And once you have this, it turns out we can use Python to solve these as well. And let's go ahead and show you how we built these particular functions. So let's go back into Chrome. Just for the record, this Colab is now available on the course website. So if you go to the course website, I've already posted the Colab, which is the one I'm editing right now, and so you can follow along, and you don't need to copy and you don't need to be hurriedly typing things out. Is it just a continuation? Yes. So today's lecture is a continuation of Wednesday. It's just one more dimension. We'll be getting into slightly more complicated regressions, but yeah, that's exactly what we're doing. We're taking things we did on Wednesday, and we're just adding one dimension to it right now. And so we have a two-variable regression. But first, of course, we need to do all of our imports. So here I've just listed a bunch of imports. Again, this is just the libraries that we're using. And now for this two-variable regression, remember last time we had to do a reshaping. So last time we had to do something to reshape into a column. Here I've just written it all out as a column vector. So if you print out x here, you get an array of coordinates, which is this two-column matrix. So you can think of it as each of these rows is a data point, is a location. So it's an xy coordinate. And then we have a z as the dependent variable here. So we have just the values of the dependent variable. And once we have all these things, what we can do is you just use the exact same linear regression model. So here I'm saying linear model is equal to linear regression, linear model.fit. So again, we're fitting our x's and our y's. And x, of course, is a column vector where each of the two-column matrix where each of the rows is one of our xy coordinates. And then we get the coefficients. So we have two coefficients, m1 and m2, because of course we have two independent variables, and those happen to be these values, minus 0.25 and minus 0.31. And of course we can also get the y-intercept. So these are all doing this exact same things we did last time. And then we can do predictions. So if we want to predict a particular point, you can predict that for the coordinate 1, 2, it's 14.1 degrees, or 14.2 degrees Celsius. Now, here I did something a little bit more advanced, which is I have an interactable, draggable 3D scatter plot with a plane on it. I don't expect you to understand all this code. You should take a look at it if you're interested in Python. I won't expect you to reproduce this, just because it is a little bit more advanced. But what you can see is, well, you end up with a plot of both the plane and all these different scattered data points. And so you can sort of see whether or not this fits just visually. Or, of course, you can also compute the mean squared error before. So let's go back to the PowerPoint and just talk about what we mean by this multilinear regression. So here we had two independent variables. Sometimes we actually want more than two independent variables. Actually, let's just go through a full taxonomy of this. So we started out on Wednesday with one independent variable and one dependent variable. So that gives us a model which looks like f of x is equal to mx plus b. So it's just a line. Our model is a line. We're just trying to find the parameters m and b that make for the best fit line. Here we just showed you an example with two independent variables and one dependent variable. So now the model changes a bit. So now the model is f of xy is equal to m1x plus m2y plus b. So we have three parameters that we need to fit. And now you'll notice that this is also, you can think of this as a function from the plane to the z-axis. And so you can rewrite this in vector form as a function f of xy is equal to the dot product of m1, m2, or you can think of this as a matrix product, xy plus b. Okay, so this is just a different way of writing things, but it turns out that this notation will be super helpful once we have lots of variables. And so indeed, we don't have to stop at just 2 independent variables. You can have many independent variables. So maybe temperature, location, like time, maybe those are all independent variables, and you're trying to model like reproduction rate based off of a bunch of independent variables. These are harder to visualize, but luckily, using the tools in linear algebra, we can still draw this out in a pretty straightforward way. So let's go ahead and write this out mathematically. So the model here is we have a model, f of, it's some column vector. I'm going to use x1 through xn as the different coordinates in the vector. So note that I'm changing notation slightly on you. Instead of these being separate data points, these are now different independent variables. I apologize for the notational confusion, but these are all very standard ways of writing these things. And so this is equal to some vector of coefficients, matrix product or dot product, with this vector of variables, of independent variables, plus b, and this is some function from r to the n to r. Okay, and it turns out that when we do this in Python, you use exactly the same code, except of course you need to have more coordinates in your x vector. So instead of a moment ago we had each of just 2 columns, you just have more columns when you have multiple independent variables. Now, notably, we're not going to get into that in this class, but you can also have many independent variables and many dependent variables. So that would be something, you'd end up with functions of the sort f from Rn to Rp. So some other, why isn't it x, y, z? You can also call it x, y, z. So basically, you can call these different names. So if you were going from R3 to R, you maybe use x, y, z, and then you'd have some other variable, w or something like that. All these are just names. We can call them whatever name we want. We can call them alpha, beta, gamma. We can call them x, y, z. We can call them x1, x2, x3. Depending on what you're doing, sometimes different notation is more or less helpful. Does that answer your question? Okay, so that's a lot of lecturing. I want you guys to try it out now. I think I might have given you, that's actually a little bit of an issue because I think I gave you the answers. But you guys should still try it out and tell me what which one of these answers it is. So look at the code. I've obviously given you all the code already in the Colab, but you should still see like how it works and then predict the water temperature here. Let me reset the poll. And so this is just my sanity check to make sure that you guys, roughly speaking, understand what's going on. Okay, and why doesn't my chat reset? Oh, okay. Okay, so this was probably in some ways too easy of a problem because I gave you all the code for it. But let's take a look at it and walk through it. So basically, we have all these Lake Ontario temperatures, and we're going to predict the temperature of the lake near Toronto. So how do we do that? Well, we have all these different coordinates. You enter in the coordinates as this two column format. So here I put in a bunch of new lines to make it easier. Note that it would have been the same thing if I had written. Instead of using new lines, I had just put them all together, 76.5, 43.9. So this means the same thing, etc. But I wrote it out in this way to make it just a little bit easier to see that it is a two-column vector. And so we then have our array of temperatures. So those are our temperatures here. Then you just set model is equal to linear regression, and then you have to fit the model. And then here, I've predicted that the water temperature, so you do model predict. You do need a double bracket here. And the water temperature near Toronto is 12.35 degrees Celsius. And yeah, it looks like everyone got that correct, as it would be hoped. Okay, so that's the basic idea behind linear regression. And multilinear regression. You can have multiple variables. But now, what if our data doesn't look like a line? Well, this is an issue, right? So let me draw out some data here. So let's suppose we have an XY plane, I'm just going to look at the positive quadrant, and let's suppose we have a bunch of data points. Okay, so I have a bunch of data points, and in this particular case, this doesn't look very linear, right? So even if you draw a line, so wait, what color am I going to use? Let's use blue. So if I try to do a best fit line, it doesn't matter what the line is. Lines fit terribly because their data isn't actually linear. And so, of course, this is one of the sort of judgment calls you're going to have to make, because if you put these things into Python, Python will give you the best fit line. So Python will give you a line, and you'll need to figure out whether or not the fit is actually good. And one way of looking at this is to look at the mean squared error. There are a couple other metrics that you might have heard of, like R squared, the sum of the squared errors. There are a number of different metrics we can use to try to figure out how well it fits. But in this particular case, even the best fit line fits very terribly. Now, just sort of staring at this, you might be thinking, well, maybe a line doesn't work, but maybe we could do a parabola instead. So let's see. Maybe if we did a parabola, that would fit a little bit better. And that is true. So parabola fits better. And this would be something we'd call quadratic optimization. But maybe, like, staring at this, the parabola still isn't perfect. So maybe if you add another, yet another variable, you could like fit it as a cubic equation. So maybe something like that. So maybe cubic equation even better. Oh, sorry, regression. Too many terms. Better quadratic regression. Sorry, yes, I'm using only the term regression here. Yeah. Yeah, optimization is a slightly different associated thing, but here we are talking about regression. So now there are different types of regression, and I'm going to label these all as regression. The terminology varies slightly depending on the course you're taking, so just be aware that people will call these things slightly different things. But I'm going to go ahead and call these different types of regression. So we have a linear regression, so just f of x is equal to mx plus b. We have quadratic regression, so f of x is equal to m2x squared plus m1x plus b. So here we're trying to come up with a quadratic function, and here quadratic functions are, of course, some constant times x squared plus some constant times x plus some constant, plus some other constant. You can have cubic regression, where you have f of x is equal to m3 x cubed plus m2x squared plus m1x plus b. So these are all just, you're guessing different shapes of your model. So you might use a cubic model, a quadratic model, or you're guessing different shapes of the model, and then you're trying to fit the best parameters. Oh, there's a question. What is regression exactly? That's a very good question, and the term comes from, the term is historically a little bit fraught. It comes from trying to understand the relationship between different variables, and there's this phenomenon which you might have heard of called regression to the mean. Where when you have a bunch, but we're not going to discuss that too much. That might be something you cover in statistics class. The basic idea behind regression is you're trying to use these various, you're trying to build a model where you have these independent variables that explain your dependent variable. So you have some dependent variable, which is this observation. So maybe the height of a tree or the temperature of the water. And you have these other variables, which we call independent variables. These are the sort of what you're guessing caused the effect you're like measuring. So if you are looking at the height of a tree, you might think, well, maybe the time is what determines how tall the tree is. And so regression is just trying to explain some dependent variable based off of the values of some independent variables. Does that answer your question, Jordan? Yeah, so what does a cubic function look like? Well, you should play around in Desmos, but cubic functions often look like lat, or like, oh, I'm messing this up, aren't I? But yeah, so cubic functions, there are a number of them. So some of them just look like lat, some of them look like lat. You could also have them going the other way. So cubic functions look like that, whereas parabolas look something like that or like that. Lines, well, hopefully you know what lines look like. Yep. And of course, we're just looking at different polynomials here. So, right, we have the linear ones, we have quadratic polynomials, we have cubic polynomials, and we can keep on going. So it turns out that, we can have polynomials of any degree. And you can use this to fit to you can use any polynomial to fit to your data. Sometimes, though, maybe your data doesn't look polynomial, and you might want to use a different type of function. So we also have exponential functions, and so you can also do exponential regression, where you have two different coefficients that you're trying to figure out to create an exponential function that looks like the best fit to your data. And related to that, very closely related to that, you also have power dependencies, where you have these two coefficients, and you have your independent variable to some power is what determines your dependent variable. So you have a bunch of different types of regression, and one of the for certain types of regression, you can actually convert them into a linear regression problem, and that makes it a lot easier to understand because you can just use the same techniques that people have developed for linear regression to solve these particular types of regression. There are other much more complicated types of data analysis that you can't convert into a linear problem, but for our purposes, we're only going to focus on the ones you can convert to a linear problem. So, how do we convert a nonlinear regression to a multilinear one? Well, based on the way I wrote out the equations, it might be something that you might guess that, well, we need to convert it into a multilinear form. So we just need to substitute a bunch of variables. So let's say that we want a model f of x is equal to m2x squared plus m1x plus b. Well, what you'll notice is that, what if we introduce a new independent variable? So let's say we let y be equal to x squared, and then we have a new function, f of xy is equal to m2y plus m1x plus b. Well, if we started out with, let's say we had x values, let's say 1, 2, minus 1, 4, and we had some f of x, so this is the output of the function. Let me write this over a little bit, actually. Oh, I erased too much. X squared. Let's say we had some output of the function, so f of x, and let's say these values were 0.1, 5.2, 6.9, 4.2. Doesn't really matter. Well, here, you'll notice that we could do an ordinary linear regression on this, and that would get us a line. But if we introduce a new variable, so let's introduce a new variable, y is equal to x squared, and this would be 2, 4, 1, 16, then all of a sudden, you have two different independent variables that you can then do a multilinear regression on. Because then what you do is you just put each of these coordinates in, so put each of these coordinates in as your independent variable, and you still have the same output, f of x, and then you use the same Python or same data analysis pipeline to do a linear regression on this new augmented system. And of course, you can do the same thing with cubic equations. So maybe the cubic equations, they look something like f of x is equal to m3x cubed plus m2x squared plus m1x plus b. Well, all we have to do is can you do linear regression by hand? Yes, you can. It is kind of painful, but yes, you can. There are ways of doing it. Certainly for a single linear regression, you can do all this by hand, because all you have to do is, we solved this last time, remember? So you just need to, in the theorem we had at the end of the first half of lecture last time, we gave you a formula for doing linear regression for just a single dependent variable and single independent variable. And you can extend these ideas to multilinear regression, and so you can do this by hand. It's just really, really painful. So no one does it by hand these days. But people did do it by hand originally when people were inventing these techniques. But in any case, here we're going to have three different variables. So let's say we let's keep x the same, and let's y be equal to x squared, and z be equal to x cubed. Well, then you could also write this as a xyz is equal to m1, m2, M3 XYZ plus B. Okay, so you can rewrite this as a cubic equation, and then we have a third column, so that would be Z is equal to X cubed. So this would be... Oh, someone should have caught that I did this X squared wrong. It turns out that 1 squared is not 2. 1 squared is 1. So 1, 4, 1, 16. So X cubed here would be then 1, 8, minus 1, 64. And so then you could do a multilinear regression with these 3 independent variables, and which would allow you to solve for the coefficients m1, m2, and m3, which would give you a cubic surface in R4 that best approximates this, a hyperplane in R4 that best approximates this function. Your best approximates your data. Now, you have to be a little bit careful about too many parameters. So, let's suppose that I give you a model. And I'm going to ask you which of these models will have a smaller error. So let's suppose I have okay, so I have something that looks like that. And let me reset my poll before getting it set up. And my question is, which model will have smaller mean squared error for the following data? Ah, okay, so it looks like people are guessing quadratic. A lot of people are guessing quadratic. Okay, so that seems like a very reasonable guess, right? Because this looks like a parabola. But now you have to be a little bit careful because remember, we had the formula for the quadratic, which was f of xy is equal, f of x is equal to m2x squared plus m1x plus b. And we had the formula for the cubic, which was f of x is equal to m3x cubed plus m2x squared plus m1x plus b. What if m3 is equal to 0? Not 3. Why did I write a 3 there? What if m3 is equal to 0? If m3 is equal to 0, then a cubic model just turns into a quadratic model. So anything a quadratic model can do, a cubic model can do just as well, if not better. I mean, often better. So in this case, maybe you have your quadratic, which looks like that, and maybe you have your cubic, which looks like that, but they both actually have the same mean squared error. So it turns out that for the same data, cubic will always have no higher error than quadratic. So we have a really good question in the chat. Would quadratic be considered an overfit? And this is actually a very, very subtle question about statistics. What does it mean to overfit data? And unfortunately, we don't have enough time in this class to actually go into detail about what it means to overfit, but we are going to talk about it. So that actually leads me into my next slide. So thank you for that question, which is you should be really careful about too many parameters. So the more parameters you have, for example, in the polynomial regression, the better your mean squared error will be. And this is because sometimes you will overfit to your data, as Sarah is asking. So there's a famous quote by John von Neumann, with 4 parameters, what was the answer? The answer here was C. C will always have a cubic, for the same data, a cubic model will always have as low of a mean squared error as a quadratic model, because cubic models include all quadratic and all linear models. And a quadratic model will always have a lower or equal mean squared error as a linear model. And that's because here we have another question about parameters. Parameters are just these different constants you're solving for. So a quadratic model has 3 different parameters, whereas a cubic model has 4 parameters. And when you have more parameters, you could always just set one of your parameters equal to 0, and you get the lower parameter model. Someone's asking, why isn't the answer D? Well, the answer isn't D because the cubic might still be slightly better than the quadratic, even though this data looks like it's actually quadratic. And certainly, like the linear model, so a linear model here, it's not going to be a linear model. The linear model is going to have much, much worse error. But if we're going to think about it, there's a really famous quote by John von Neumann: with 4 parameters I can fit an elephant, and with 5 I can make him wiggle his trunk. Basically, the more parameters you have, the better you can fit your data, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's a good thing. Let me give another example that will make this a little bit more obvious. So suppose we have data that looks like this. Okay, so we have list data. And the first thing you might think is, well, maybe list data means that we have a line. So maybe draw a list line, and that seems to have pretty good mean squared error. So this is a pretty good fit, right? But it turns out that if you have enough parameters, you could draw a polynomial that did something like this. Okay, so it turns out that with enough work, you could construct a polynomial to do that. And this is clearly a better fit, but using more parameters. So this would probably be overfit. So whenever you use more parameters, so so it turns out that if you had an arbitrarily large polynomial, you could exactly fit any data. But now the question is that any good? Because if you look at this data, these points here, you might be like, well, my model is suggesting that at low, let's say this is our x-axis and this is our y-axis, at low values of the x-axis, we go to like negative infinity. And at the high values, we jump up to infinity. Now, the question isn't whether or not... So remember, when we were talking about models, we want models that are good at predicting new data. But of course, we don't have any... we don't necessarily have new data. And so we have to fit to our existing data. But if you fit too well to your existing data, it turns out then you actually can't predict anything. And so this is an incredibly well fit to our data. But what happens if I have a new point? So if I add a new point, and it's somewhere here, then that's not very well fit. Or if it's somewhere here, that's also not very well fit. And so it turns out that if you add too many parameters, you get a ton of explanatory power for fitting to your existing data, but you can't predict very well for the future because your model has too many parameters and it's only telling you what your, in other terms, your training data is saying. And so this is actually a bad thing. And so there's some amount of finesse in deciding how many parameters to use. If you increase the number of parameters, you will always get a better fit, but it's not necessarily a better model. So you have to be really careful whenever you add a new model and add a new parameter, and you really do need to make sure that your model really needs that new parameter. When you take a statistics class at some point, or a mathematical modeling in biology course, this will be something that will be emphasized much more strongly. For now, though, I'm just going to leave you with this warning that even though you can always fit it better with more parameters, that's not necessarily a good thing. Any questions about that? Okay, but even despite all that, it is still useful to have all these different nonlinear models because sometimes the data really isn't linear. So, for example, on this particular data set, a linear line really doesn't work, and so you do want to go up in parameters to at least quadratic. Now, even though a cubic will get you a better fit, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a good thing. And so there's some amount of choice that you have as a biologist in like how many parameters you want your model to have. And when you put in too many parameters, things don't work out. Later on, when you take more data analysis, people might talk about a separation between a training set and a test set and a validation set or things like that. And these are all different or like cross-validation. These are all techniques people use to try to figure out when their model has too many parameters. Like I said, we're not going to have enough time to get into all of that, and that's pretty advanced. But these are things you should watch out for when you're actually applying these techniques in the field. Okay, having said that, let's go back to our nonlinear models. And the polynomial models are the easiest ones to explain, right? So you just take the polynomial, you take each of the coefficients, you turn them, each of the x squared, x cubed, into a separate variable, and then you do the multilinear regression on that. Now, for other types of nonlinear models, it's a little bit more complicated. So, for example, we might have an exponential here. And we have f of, oh, there's a question. Would you actually use the cubic or polynomial for this one? So if I were modeling this particular data set as a biologist, I would use a cubic. Because what you want is you want the lowest number of parameters that will explain your data. And so here, the cubic and I would use the quadratic. There. I would use the quadratic even though the cubic will have a lower error, because you want the lowest number of parameters that still explains your data. Does that answer your question? Okay. Actually, before we move on to exponential regression, let's show you how this would actually play out in the Colab. So for this quadratic regression here, we have an MP array. So this is just our original data points. I've reshaped them, so this does look like, so this is a column vector. We have our array of data points. I plotted the scatter plot here, and if you just do a basic linear regression, well, you end up with this line here. So this doesn't actually, so this is the best fit line, but it isn't actually a very good fit. So what we can do instead is we can create a new data vector. What just happened? Something went wrong. Let's run them all again. Okay, there. So we have our x vector, which looks like this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And we can create a new vector, x2, which is x squared, so x times x. And then we stack the two together, and then you end up with 1, 1, 2, 4, 3, 9, 4, 16, 5, 25, 6, 36, 7, 49, etc. So that's our new x vector, so this new x combined vector. And we can build a quadratic model by just using linear regression and fitting this x combined to our y variable, which was from up here. And then we get some model coefficients here. So we get, these are their m1 and m2, and of course we have an intercept, and so we get this function. And when we plot that function out, you get a quadratic line that is a pretty good fit. Now, of course, you can keep on doing this, and you could create a third variable, x3, that's x cubed. And that would get you at least as good of a fit, if not better. But in this particular case, the quadratic model is good enough to explain our data, and so we don't want to add unnecessary extra parameters, or we run the risk of overfitting to our data. Okay, so let's go back to our exponential regression example, which I was getting started on. And it turns out that there are different ways of converting your equation into something that looks linear. Let's say we had f of x is equal to c1 e to the c2x. I'm using slightly different coefficients because the coefficients aren't going to be exactly the same in this case. So if you take log of both sides, so natural log of f of x is equal to natural log of c1 e to the c2x, well, that's equal to natural log of c1 plus natural log of c e to the, I messed it up, natural log of e to the c2x, which is equal to natural log of c1 plus c2x. So now we can do a change of variables. So we're going to let, let's say z be equal to natural log of f of x, and we're going to let m2 be equal, m be equal to c2, and b be equal to natural log of c1. And that gets us a new model, z is equal to mx plus b, which is of course just a basic linear model now, with two parameters. And of course you can go backwards, so you can get f of x is equal to e to the z, c2 is equal to m, and c1 is equal to e to the b. Okay, so we've done a change of variables In the previous cases, we didn't have to change much because the coefficients were still the same coefficients. Here, the coefficients are actually different. Let me turn off my polling just so that I don't cover up anything. Something went wrong. Okay, anyway, that seems all right. So what then you would then do is you would start off with your two sets of variables, so you have x and f of x, and you convert that entire thing into a new system where you have x and natural log of f of x. And then you do linear regression on that system. And you do something similar with power dependencies, which let's go over to now. So basically, you're doing a change of variables, and you're changing it into a new form that is linear, or multilinear, and then you're applying normal linear regression on that changed form, and then using the algebraic transformation to transform it back. I will repeat it for this power dependency, and then we'll see an example. So hopefully that'll explain things a little bit more. So for power dependencies, we have a function f of x is equal to c1 x to the c2. And so when we take the natural log of this, when we take the natural log of both sides, we get a new function. Natural log of f of x is equal to natural log of c1 plus natural log of x c to the c2, which is equal to natural log of c1 plus c2 times the natural log of x. So now we do a change of variables. So the change of variables is we're going to let z be equal to natural log of f of x. We're going to let m be equal to c2, and we're going to let y be equal to natural log of x, and b be equal to natural log of c1. Once we do that, what do we end up with? And we can, of course, reverse these things by just taking the exponentials instead. So x is equal to e to the y, c1 is equal to e to the b. And when we reverse all these things, or when we do this variable substitution, you end up with a new system, z is equal to my plus b. And this here is a linear regression problem. Okay, so what have we done? So here what we did is our original set of variables were x and f of x, right? So that was our independent variable and our dependent variable. And now what we've done is we've converted it into a new system, which has new variables. Y is equal to natural log of x, and z is equal to natural log of f of x. So here, this was dependent, and this was independent. Here we have a new system where that's independent and that's dependent. And we basically just converted all of our data points. So by transforming all of our data points in this way, we've turned a nonlinear problem into a linear problem. And some of you may have seen log-log plots before. And that's exactly what we're doing here. Now, this is probably a bit confusing, so we'll end with another practical example. So, this is actually one of the problems from your textbook from from the Bittinger textbook. So suppose this is one of the problems in the section. But anyway, the table below shows the number of plant species on islands in the Pacific as a function of their size. So maybe you have 6 islands. One of them is 2 square miles, another's 2 square miles, one's 9 square miles, one's 17 square miles, one's 180, one's 2,500, and they have this many different species of plants. So we can write that out. So we have our array of these sizes. So that's our x variable, our independent variable. Our y variable is the number of species. And when we plot this out, it looks something like this. And that's a sort of weird look, isn't it? This does not look linear. You could draw a line like this, but it wouldn't be a very good line. And it seems like that's not actually the right kind of plot. So what instead we're going to do is we're going to transform all the variables. So we had our x variable and our y variable. We're going to transform them to x log and y log. Yes. So yes, exactly. It looks exponential. And so because it looks exponential, you might think to do a log-log plot. So that's often one of the things people do when something looks exponential, is they either do a log-log plot or a semi-log plot. And what you do is you transform the variables by taking log of the variable. Sometimes you do it for just one of the variables. Here we're going to do it for both of the variables. And when you do that transformation and plot the scatter plot, it Well, it doesn't quite look like a line, but it looks a lot closer to a line, and so maybe a line is the best way of explaining it after you've done this transformation. So, of course, now we have x log and y log as our data points. Let me print out what those look like, actually. So print x log, y log. And so, let's not do that. Let's print x log and print y log. So we have x log here and y log. So these are transformed versions where you're just taking the logarithm of our original data points here. And this log-log plot actually looks like it might be linear. So let's try using a log model. Oh, sorry, our linear regression on this log-log plot. And so I'm going to call this log model. We're going to fit x log and y log, and we're going to plot the scatter plot as well as these predicted points. And when we do this, yeah, this line looks like a pretty good explanation. But of course, now we're working in log-logs, in a log-log plot. And so if you wanted to convert it back, which you don't have to do because you could predict things from here, but if you want to convert it back and see what it looks like, well, we have our original points, so we do the scatter plot of x and y again. And then I'm going to plot out the coefficients, I'm going to plot out the predictions of this. This is a slightly more advanced way of drawing this curve, just so it looks more like a curve. But this is the function that you end up getting. So this exponential function is the growth is the function that you end up getting from this model once you transform this line from this log-log plot back into this ordinary xy plot. And it's not perfect, but it's still a better explanation than a line would have been in this case. And so often when you look at data, the exponential functions actually appear a lot in biology, because if you think about like reproduction, things along those lines, there's often an exponential growth. And so when you have anything that's exponential, you can transform an exponential thing by putting it on a log-log plot, like the one here. And so it's a line only in log-log. So there's a linear relationship between log of x and log of y, which means there's an exponential relationship between x and y. Yeah, so down here, we're just undoing the log-log transformation. So here, what I've done is I've taken exponentials of the prediction. This is a little bit more complicated, but basically you're undoing everything down here just to see the plot back in the original xy axes. But why would you undo it? Well, often in biology, you don't necessarily undo it. I'm just showing you the fact that you can undo it here. This model is perfectly good for predicting things. So once you have the log-log plot, you can use this to predict things once you've done this transformation. But the basic idea behind all these data transformations is you can transform your data from one form to another that makes the transformed data roughly linear. And once your transformed data is roughly linear, then you can use ordinary linear regression and build a model that way. But of course, in order to do that, what you're really doing is you're building some kind of exponential model that looks more like this in the actual original space. And these types of transformations are really common in data science, and if you take statistics, you'll see more of these types of things. And I think that's actually a very good place to end my lecture for today, because we've talked about multilinear and nonlinear regression, and I think that's all I had. So yeah. So again, what we're basically doing is we're showing that you can have more variables, and you can also make use of these extra variables and transform nonlinear plots into things that look more linear by turning them into these multilinear regressions. And that will be about it. So thank you very much, and I'm going to end my recording now.